I'm Salvador Cordova, and I'm here talking with James Cameron, and we're going to be discussing Noah's flood. We'll just take it from here. There was James had an article, a few articles he wanted to talk about, some literature. And we're just going to have a discussion. This is a quasi-debate, but my goal is to try to have an academic discussion about the facts, reasons, and evidence for having one viewpoint versus another. Many of you who'll be tuning in know that I definitely stand on the side of the truth of Noah's flood, but we're going to just try to examine the evidence that is available to us and try to come up with how it might be evaluated. So James, if you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be able to do this with you and just.
Oh, James, your audio came down. Can you?
Oh yeah. Is that better?
Yes, thanks.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm glad to be on here. I'm glad to be able to have a conversation with you and just discuss. I think it's important, as I'm sure you probably would too, that by examining evidence, we can come to logical conclusions, and you may be right, I may be right. Certainly, one of us is probably right. We would probably both agree, but the only way that we can really determine that, I would argue at least, is by looking at evidence and determining kind of what works. So yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into the evidence for the flood and seeing what we find out.
All right. So thanks for starting this conversation. I guess the conversation began because you brought up this article on the global flood. It can be found on Wiki, rationalwiki.org, about the global flood. Sometimes your audio fades out. Would you like to read some parts of it that you really like, that you were interested in, and we can talk about it?
Yeah, let me pull it up. So I think there's a number of things that are important to discuss in the arc, so maybe we just kind of go through it. First of all, I think it's very difficult to demonstrate.
James, you're cutting out again. I'm really sorry.
I apologize. I'll try and make this
I'm sorry to nag you so
much. No, you're all good. So I think it's important to start just by, like, both of us maybe understanding that the burden of proof that a flood happened would stand with a creationist simply because it's an extraordinary claim, and it's an extraordinary claim that God created the flood and caused this catastrophic event that destroyed much of humanity from the place of the earth. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in general. I think it's very important that people have reasons to believe something. Although I would say that sometimes the level of belief, something may be actually true, and there may not be a lot of evidence for it. So when we say extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, that means, to me, that means that it makes it more believable if you have extraordinary evidence. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's false. So
I totally agree.
So it may be that that over time we get more facts available to us that we didn't have, and then an idea can then become a little bit more viable. I think it's valuable to be skeptical. I think that's a great quality to try to determine the truth. I mean, if I have students or children, I wouldn't want them believing everything they hear. That's just, I had employees that worked for me I was an engineer and scientist. I wouldn't want them believing everything that they hear. That's not a quality that I don't think that's a virtue. That's really bad. So
Sure, I'm sure we would agree on that. Yeah.
so now regarding the flood, this does have I am a Christian, and it has metaphysical implications. So I do have a personal interest in this. The reason I like going over opposing viewpoints is I think it's good to review the evidence and also see valid objections, because if someone holds a belief and there are problems in the scientific models they have, it would help to try to engage it. And it's really not good to just kind of cover them over or sweep them under the rug or pretend these problems don't exist. That's not really good. And I find that for a lot of people, having an attitude of being dismissive or trivializing serious problems, that doesn't inspire trust. That's just not the way I personally would do business. I've had a lot of problems with churches that just wouldn't address this, and I don't think that's good. That's just not the way I would want to do business. So the way that I'm going to approach this is try to look at the data that we have in hand and kind of minimize any appeals to sacred text. I mean, obviously, I have reverence for it, but I want to see what we can arrive at without having to refer to testimony of others right now. So that's kind of my approach. So that's why I was interested in trying to review what this article had. Just for the sake of transparency, I actually didn't read this article. I didn't have time to. So if you'd like to read some of your favorite sections, this would be a good time. And please be sure to speak up for our listeners.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I mean, can you see my screen right now?
I don't think it's clear to everyone.
Okay.
And they can read it. So that's kind of why I'm having you, if it's not too much trouble, if you could just highlight some of the things that really stood out to you.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. Also, I would love to just give a little bit of a backstory in terms of my beliefs as well. I actually was a Christian up until about a couple months ago. Grew up in the church and whatnot, and my dad's an elder in the church, and telling him that I don't necessarily believe anymore was not an easy thing for me to do. But at the same time, it was something that I felt like evidence just suggested that, a belief in a Christian faith was exactly that. It's just a faith. And I mean, at a certain point, my faith just kind of, I don't know. It was just washed away by what I felt was just an overwhelming amount of evidence against it. And so I'm open-minded in the sense that I think, what, maybe it is all possible that it happened, but I just don't see the evidence for it. And so that's kind of where I stand right now. But anyway, we can get into some of the
sure.
particulars.
Well, first off, I have your permission, if this recording goes well, to put this on the net. I think it would be valuable for other people to hear your story.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's just too much of people not trying to deal with facts, and they need to hear what you had to say. So thank you for sharing that. So what you're telling me is you've not, when you're, did you used to believe in Noah's flood? I mean,
I did, yeah.
Okay.
Up until probably about maybe 4 or 5 months ago, there was a period of time where I went from total belief and total faith. I never really questioned a whole lot to being, I'm a Christian, but I don't necessarily know if it's metaphorical, to now kind of the position that I take today, which is I just don't necessarily believe any of the Christian claims anymore.
Okay. I actually will sympathize, since you told me about your background. I nearly left the Christian faith for similar reasons. I actually, sometimes when I expressed doubt in the church, I was scolded for it. I was criticized. I was ridiculed. And when I went into the scientific discipline, I was never treated that way. In fact, when I expressed questions and skepticism, I was valued for it. So I had a lot of resentment for uh, how I was treated, and uh, I get very angry actually when I see other people being treated, especially young people being treated that way in the church.
Yeah.
It's,
I don't want to mischaracterize the people that I did have interactions with and I did have discussions with in regards to these
yeah,
matters, because a lot of them are fantastic people.
yeah,
It's just a matter of, it ultimately boiled down for me where I was like, I was talking with people, I'd have discussions with people, and I ultimately kind of hit a brick wall because I had done far more research than a lot of them had.
yeah,
And so when I try and engage in conversations with them, it was difficult because we weren't necessarily on a level playing field. And the conversation always resorted back to, well, you don't necessarily have enough faith. And that was difficult for me because I was like, I just want answers to the questions, but I don't necessarily have them. And so how am I supposed to believe what the Bible says, or what I've been taught growing up without necessarily the evidence to support it? And so that was always the difficulty. I don't necessarily hold anything against them. I think a lot of, like, I still love my family, still love all the people around me and whatnot. It's just we have a difference of belief, a difference of opinion.
uh, by the way, that's great to hear that you love these people. It was a mixed bag for me, and there were some experiences that were pretty bitter. um, I mean, I just it was difficult getting all the backbiting and just kind of the demonizing of me, and I'm still kind of recovering from it. So, um, in many respects, I spent a lot of time with atheists, and I enjoyed the fact that they valued, um, they were skeptical, and they valued data, and they valued evidence. I wouldn't say that for all of them. Some of them are very ideological. I don't get along with that. Now there's several profiles of atheists, and they're not like one monolithic group, um, because there's some that are more open-minded than others.
Yeah.
So there are studies on this. So now the way that we met was through the internet, and you posted that you're an atheist now, so you consider yourself an atheist. And
Yeah.
I'm just setting the terms of the debate, so or the discussion really. So given that I didn't read what you had linked to, would you like to cover some things?
Yeah, of course. So
You can just read it verbatim, by the way. That's
okay,
perfectly fine.
yeah, I'll go through it. I also just want to establish kind of what my belief is real quickly, because
Sure.
atheism can be misconstrued in a lot of different ways. I simply mean that I'm not saying it's impossible that a flood didn't happen. I'm just saying that there isn't the evidence to support it. Therefore, I don't believe in it.
Well,
if that makes any sense.
oh yes.
That's my understanding.
No, if I could frame this, I usually ask people what would help you believe, and I've come to the conclusion that many times we don't have as much data as we would like to persuade us of something, because there are a lot of decisions in life where, yeah, we'd like to know what the right answer is, and we just don't have the data. I mean, there are people that everyone makes life decisions, for example, about like what school to go to, what job to take, and who to marry, etc. And so there are a lot of decisions where we would really like to have more data to help us decide, and it's usually we don't have enough.
That was very true. And I'm okay. I would even say that as an unbeliever, if there was evidence that would suggest that the flood is possible, but it's not necessarily provable, that would, for me, be enough evidence to maybe say, you know what, I'm okay with it. Because I think I do hold a little bit of, I would say, how do I put this? I do take a little bit of stock. I do think that there is something to faith and there is something to a God. It's hard for me to necessarily understand if that's just thoughts running through my head or if that's just or if it's actually kind of reality, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
And so
yes, yes.
if there's reasonable doubt that the flood didn't occur, um, then that would be enough from me, I would say. I just don't think there is.
And that's fine. So we'll go at it with just say, let's just have a look at the data, and uh, I'll emphasize again. I totally understand that when people are saying that they would like to have more evidence, I take it on, especially people that are genuinely curious.
Mhm.
I respect that, and I'll tell you the reason why. I had agonized over these questions for about 20 years myself. And I now study the question professionally.
Mm.
Uh, and I used to accept evolution. I was raised in a Christian home, nearly left the Christian faith. I accepted evolution, and then I rejected it shortly
Mm.
before going to college. But I always believed that the universe was old, and there was some sort of creation event, but it didn't seem to quite agree with what I was learning in my science classes.
Mm.
But I said, yeah, it's close enough for my purposes. And but then, as I studied the Bible more, the experience that I had, people don't want to admit this, but sometimes when they study the Bible really carefully as a critical thinker, it
Mm.
actually makes it less believable. And that's what was
Yeah.
happening to me. That may not be true for other people, but that's what happened to me. And things regarding the origins, especially the book of Genesis, made me doubt. And so I nearly left the faith. And then I began to review the evidence.
Mm.
Um, Now, it may not be as much evidence as we would like to have, but it gave me a perspective on things. And I'm actually curious to see some of the opposing views. Some of them are actually not resolved to this day. So when I said I'm professionally interested in this, uh, the reason I was interested in the discussion, I want to continue to see what sort of problems there are,
Mm.
because those are areas that need to be investigated. And if we don't have enough data to resolve the issue one way or the other, we just have to say, well, this looks good or this doesn't look good for the flood. And
Yeah.
I think we owe it to tell it, you know, I teach some of this stuff in church, and I feel a moral obligation to say, hey, this, and I actually do say this. I said, hey, sometimes uh, there are aspects of this that are very problematic. I just got to level with you. Maybe it may be solved, but um,
Mm.
I have an ethical responsibility to at least give my assessment if it doesn't meet what I would consider standards of proof.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's good to hear. So yeah, we can just go through it. So the article that I referenced, it's a rationalwiki.org article, and it's
okay,
regarding the global flood. And I guess if we're just going through this, the first important thing to at least establish is whether or not the Bible references an actual global flood. But I've also heard the argument that it was a local flood as well. Um, and the reason why I think that that's important is because if we can dismiss the local flood, like I'm sure me and you would both agree that yeah, local flood is possible, at least naturally speaking.
yes,
However, uh, in regards to a global flood, that actually poses far more issues in regards to science and the evidence that we have. So, would it be safe to say that we're both referring to a global flood?
yes, we're both referring to it.
Okay, cool.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
And what I try to tell my Christian friends, uh, they keep saying, well, this is the way to read Genesis. And I say, well, a lot of atheists read it literally too. And they don't agree. It doesn't necessarily mean that once you read it literally that it makes it more believable. In fact, when we read it literally, um, I try to tell them, I said, you're a lot of people leave the faith at that point. So um, I would agree that is the natural way to read it, and uh, that was the author's intent to say this was a global flood.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm most people would agree on that, but there are some people that do think that it is possible. I disagree, mainly just for the reasons that if all of humanity was wiped out, why was it local? And how could all of humanity have been wiped out by that local flood? And then also just in
Well,
regards to the animals and all that sort of stuff, why would they need to be
well,
on the
there's
ark?
one other dimension to this. How did the
Hmm.
birds get wiped out if it wasn't a global flood?
Oh yeah, that's another one. There's a lot of different problems to it,
Right,
and
right. So we're agreed.
yeah, we agree on that. So let's start with one claim that is difficult to rationalize, at least, and that's that. And I don't remember if it was you that I was having this debate with online, but I'm curious as to where you would see the a lot of the water coming from. Um,
Okay.
just
Um,
just to be able, like.
I don't remember seeing your handle in
Mhm.
any interactions. I can be very nasty. I have bad reputation for that, so apologies if I was.
No worries.
Um,
I honestly don't know. I don't ever really read the
all
who's
right.
talking.
So can you read what it says just for the sake of our listeners because the print's kind of small. Oh, by the way,
Of course.
do you know how to expand your browser window?
I
You do a
I think
control
it's
plus.
expanded all the way.
Oh, right, you're on a Macintosh.
I'm on a Mac, yeah. It's a little bit
Can you
different.
try doing? There's a way to expand the text or the zoom to
I
zoom it
can I
in.
can zoom in like this.
Yeah, zoom in and
There we go.
okay.
So
Could
yeah, I'll
you
go
just
ahead
read
and
it?
read
Can you
this.
just read it for our listeners?
Of course, yeah. Assuming that there was no magical transformation of the landscape between the time of the flood and present day, a reasonable assumption considering the time frame, the floodwaters could have to raise the sea at least to the height level at Mount Everest. And that would be in line, obviously, with the biblical description stating that the waters came up higher than the highest mountains. This is around 8.84 kilometers above current sea level, and since the volume of the land is small compared to the total volume of the water that would have required for such a flood, oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface, and the average height of the land is only about 800 meters. An easy calculation shows that the amount of water needed to achieve this would be at least 4.5 billion cubic kilometers. And I don't need to read through necessarily the rest of it, but that's the
Mhm.
gist of the argument is um, unless you were to assume that all of the mountains weren't created um, or were created during the flood, the event itself, which you would have to imagine is somewhat difficult. That mountains could be created that are higher than the level of the floodwaters. Um, it would be you would have to assume that God miraculously created a ton of water to be able to flood the earth.
This is excellent objection, and if I may ask, were you ever given any uh, oh, well, you actually just told me people didn't actually try to address these things for you. So,
Yeah.
okay, so we'll just, actually, it's just as well. I'm not going to try to link you to websites because some of them are really bad.
Okay.
I'll try to give it to you from my perspective. Um, there are problems that need to be reconciled with the volume of water. I'm going to accept on face value that these calculations are correct. I have no reason to doubt them. Uh, the model that I work from, and I'll give justifications to explain why I don't think they're ad hoc, is that the mountains didn't actually exist.
Hmm.
Heights as high as Everest didn't exist prior to the flood. That the continents actually emerged out of the water. Where all this water, um, first off, um, Everest was probably technically underneath the water, but it wasn't as high as before.
Okay.
So now that I'm not going to actually, there's only maybe one or two miracles that I'm going to even suggest. Now, the problem with miracles is they're not duplicatable in the lab.
Mm-hmm.
If we could duplicate miracles on demand, well, then we wouldn't have any need of proof of God because effectively the scientist would be God. So
I'm not denying the existence of miracles.
yeah.
You know,
So
I'm not claiming that I know that miracles don't exist.
yeah, there's only two miracles in my model, maybe even only one. The miracle is how the ark didn't break apart, or that it, and in some sense, it's not. From an evidential standpoint, the question is, was there a flood? I'm going to set aside the problem of the ark a little bit later. So we're just going to focus on just kind of geological and physical mechanics here.
Okay.
All right. So if you could, let me see if I could bring up my, can you give me a moment? I'm going to try to bring up some slides, and you'll have to de-share your screen.
Okay.
But it's going to take me a while to bring up some slides here, because I actually gave a talk on Noah's flood recently, and I just have to bring up what I actually said, because it has my graphics. So let's see if I have it here. Okay. I actually don't have that graphic handy. I'm going to bring it up. It's going to be for Sullivan Mountain.
Alrighty.
And we're going to look at it critically. I'm going to suggest, first I'm going to assert a model. Okay, it's not that it's that you have to accept it as fact, but it's more to kind of say this is where I'm headed. So I'm going to state the conclusion first, and then I'm going to try to defend it from evidence.
Okay, I'm good with that.
And I'm going to, let me see if I could bring this up. And I'll tell you when to, we'll de-share the screen here in a little bit.
Sounds good.
It's just going to take a while.
No worries.
All right. Well, actually, this would be a good chance to introduce you to the one website I like.
Okay.
Okay, so you de-shared your screen. I'm going to bring up my screen now. Let me see if I can find it.
I got it.
All right.
Neat.
This is actually, this is from www.creationscience.com.
Okay.
It was written, the founder of the website is actually a scientist. He got his PhD from MIT in like 2 years. He's a graduate of West Point and an Army Ranger, very accomplished gentleman. He also was director of a scientific research center at the Pentagon for a while before he went to creation science. So he did a lot to persuade me of the flood. So now this is a picture of the Sullivan Mountain Range here.
Yeah.
Now, do you see the folding? We call these folded rocks. Do you kind of see the bending patterns there?
Yeah.
On the top of the mountain?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so where I'm headed with this is that this is evidence that the mountains had to emerge up out of the waters very, very quickly.
Okay.
The reason for that is these for these layers to get that fold, they have to actually be somewhat wet. We call it, in the geological terms, unlithified. Unlithified, but just say, you know, it's kind of soft and bendable like clay. And if there were tectonic activity, meaning where, you know, big land masses move and then they get compressed, you could see that this has undergone some sort of compression. The debate is whether the compression took millions of years under high pressure, or whether it took, like, say, a matter of days or months or weeks under low pressure, and while the layers were unlithified. That is, these layers here, creationist theory is that these layers were still unsolidified when they got bent, and that the mountains rose up out of including the continents, rose up out of the water. So how that deals with this is one way to deal with that issue of all that huge amounts of water. The answer is we didn't need that much because the mountains weren't that high, but also that the water is from Noah's flood is still on the earth. It's in the oceans. So that's the creationist model. So this is actually this photo would probably be a year's worth of study and debate. This is the starting point where we can look at it. So the question is, how do these strata form? So if we could back up, that's how I would try to answer it. I try to say, so the counter is what physical scientific theory is a better model for what happened in the past? Did the bending, let's just even minimize this a little more. The way that we get these folded rocks, did it happen quickly over or for millions of years? That's the first question. And that's
yeah.
You know, this is more basal than Noah's flood. This is actually a legitimate scientific question aside from any theological things. Anyone who's really curious about physical and natural processes has to ask, how does this happen? So with your permission, could I at least give the case for why I believe the strata happened quickly?
Of course, yeah, go for it.
Okay. I'm going to unshare my screen, and I cannot minimize my screen while I'm recording. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce my. This could really blow up my recording. I'm going to change my screen resolution. I'm going to lower it so you could see a video.
Go for it.
Right, so the screen should look a little funny now. And
it's actually working pretty well.
All right. So all right, so I'm going to try. I could totally make a mess of this, but I'll try my best. Hang on, let me just close out a couple more windows so I can declutter everything. Go back to Zoom, and I'm going to share my screen. I want. This is a really good video. Let's see where it says Windows. Okay, can you see this screen where it shows? All right, I'm going to play a video. I don't know how well it's going to, because we're on the internet and it could be slow.
Let's test it out. I think it will work fine. I haven't had problems yet.
Okay, so the question is how quickly, what's the mechanism for strata forming? These were actual experiments. First, these are lab experiments, and then we can go to the question of whether it could be extrapolated to very large systems. But this is just, I'm going to just play it.
Go for it.
Periodic cycle turbulence. When the same experiment is carried out in the air, the settling cone displays all the features of lamination through repetitive segregation. Moreover, the laminate thickness increases with the feeding rate of the sediment.
Oh, wow.
It should be noted that laminate form in the direction of motion here at an angle exceeding 30 degrees. Given the absolute vacuum is at minus 29.92 inches of mercury, the hypothesis of turbulence is tested near complete vacuum at minus 22 inches of mercury. Lamination develops without the presence of a surrounding. Lamination therefore depends on the mechanical interaction between particles of different sizes, different shapes, and different densities.
Okay.
it's really, that's really cool right here toward the later part.
That is pretty neat.
Right. Now, I'm going to show you one more experiment here, just briefly.
Go for it.
Under submerged conditions.
Okay, now this was with water. Okay, so that was the end. I have one where they actually carried this out on a, I'm going to unshare. They carried out this experiment on large scale at the Colorado School of Mines. So they're trying to simulate. If you'd like, since, let me see if I have it. Okay, so let me share my screen again. And share I'm even going to share the computer sound. And can you see this?
I can, yeah.
All right.
A dried delta, viewed from the flume sidewalls, displays clear stratification characteristics in terms of superposition of deposits with similar particle size distribution. A cross-section is cut through the delta to examine the primary features of deposits of sediment mixtures carried out under steady flow and a continuous sediment supply. The cross-section displays a clear superposition of strata of fine particles in white and coarse particles in black with clear lamination. Looking at the cross-section of superposed strata, it is tempting to conclude that the strata correspond to successive sedimentary layers, that they result from discontinuous sedimentary periods, that each strata is younger than the one underneath it and older than the one above it, and that all points of the same strata have the same age.
Why is this important? Well, quite simply, because strata have been used to date sedimentary rocks and the fossils in them for over 100 years. And now, for the first time ever, there is experimental proof to show how strata form. And it is quite obvious that strata cannot be used to date either fossils or rocks. In fact, the fossils in the bottom strata could be younger than the fossils in the top strata.
Here you see some sea creatures which live at different ecological levels. A heavy influx of sediment arrives and they all get buried. Eventually, if no air gets to them, they could turn into fossils. Obviously, those buried in the top strata are the same age as those in the bottom strata, as they were buried in the same layer of sediment. Then another heavy layer of sediment arrives, and more sea creatures are trapped. But what is more important is the ones at the top of the previous layer were buried before the one in the bottom of the last layer. So the one at the top here is older than the one at the bottom.
Let the director of the research program explain.
La théorie de l'évolution
Evolution theory is based upon the belief that a succession of fossil species in a scale of geological time demonstrates that evolutionary progress has taken place. As we have just seen, however, and as we have shown in the laboratory, layers of incoming sediment have been wrongly identified as being strata. The scale of geological time and the chronological succession of fossils have been calculated on this mistaken belief that strata are successive layers of sediment. A single layer of sediment can sort itself out into parts of many strata. So the position of fossils, rather than showing evolution, merely indicates the distribution of marine species which lived at different depths. The theory of evolution is therefore unsupported by geology.
Il y a une autre question.
The next question is, if the creatures fossilized in the rocks show no evolutionary sequence, could they have all lived together at the same time? Since we now know that rocks don't need time to form, just enough sediment, there appears to be some reason to believe that they could have all been living together. What we see is an immense graveyard encircling the Earth of hundreds of millions of fossilized creatures who could have all been victims of the same catastrophe. The very fact that their remains were buried in vast quantities of sediment which has become rock, and that this kind of rock is only made by water, strongly indicates that the catastrophe was a cataclysmic flood that covered the entire Earth.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that argument before. So I want to, if you don't mind, I'd like to give at least my initial thoughts.
Oh yes, please, by all means. Thank you.
Yeah. So the one thing that I would point out is I think that this is just as far as I know, is that the geological column that we see in regards to strata does show a different, like not all of the animals are dispersed equally. There does seem to appear to be an element of older fossils. There are things that we would see that would be evolutionary, simpler organisms, things like that. They all tend to be at the bottom of the strata, whereas a lot of the larger, more developed, or like later fossils, I guess you could say, are found at the top. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, does that video say that they're all dispersed evenly, or did I catch that wrong?
I don't think it addressed it, and the concern you raise is a legitimate one. That's one that I'm trying to work through myself. Going back to that diagram do you remember that folded rock, Sullivan Mountain?
Yeah.
This is one thing that I found. I've asked lots of various geologists, and I actually encourage people to ask around, ask tough questions.
Mm-hmm.
I've asked, can I show you some? Can I share some slides?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thank you. And I'll explain. So the question is, did the layers? How quickly did some of the layers? Let's not, let's aim for something that's a little bit not so ambitious.
Okay.
Let's not try to explain every layer.
Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be a little time consuming.
Let's try to say how did we get a fossil in a given layer? What
Okay.
process would it have to be? So I'm going to share a slide, and I'll try to be quick. I'm very appreciative you're giving me a chance to make.
Of course,
to share,
yeah.
to share.
This is interesting for me too. So I haven't heard this argument before. So,
you know what? Thank you for saying that, because many of our listeners may not have either. And this is good. So, do you see my PowerPoint here?
I do, yeah.
Okay. I got this from a gentleman at Creation Ministries International named Joel Tay. By the way, that video that was featured, it can be found on YouTube. It was Drama in the Rocks. In the Rocks. It's a 30-minute video. I just showed some clips of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked geologists, I said, how do we get a fossil? How do we get a fossil? If something dies, like say this fish, what'll often happen is it's going to be scavenged. It's not going to, and actually a lot of creatures
survive. The fossils very rarely survive.
Right. So what conditions? I mean, they've tried to establish some experiments, because this is an interesting question. What is the process that causes the fossil to fossilize?
Yeah.
So the general theory, and this isn't creationist theory, this is just general theory, is it has to be buried rapidly in mud. that prevents it from being scavenged. And when it gets buried in mud, it dies. Now this, he looks so peaceful here now that he's laid to rest. Actually, a lot of the fossils look like they were traumatized with suffocation. At least that's what the paleontologists say. The cause of death was suffocation. It wasn't like it died and then it just kind of got buried. The cause of death was the burial.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Okay, so it has to happen very, very quickly. So now we're going to start to get into some a little bit of the math here. So since you're aware of that, I won't belabor the point. We do have some fossils like this fish, and we have some that even retain the shape of the flesh. So that's great that you're aware of that. So when I raise the question, when people say, let me see if I could. So this is the Grand Canyon. And I'll ask the geologists, I said, okay, there are fossils in these layers. And they say that it took millions of years to accumulate. The problem that I have, just from a theory standpoint, is, so you're saying on one hand, it took millions of years to accumulate, but yet on the other hand, if there are fossils in there, certain kinds of fossils, it had to be buried very rapidly in a matter of weeks, if not days, if not hours. I say that's a logical contradiction. I have serious problems with that. And they'll say, well, there was a local landslide or something. And I said, well, the problem is some of these strata span continents. The other problem that I had from an empirical standpoint, you could see the different colors of rocks there. Maybe the photograph enhanced it, but there's no question that they're different kinds of sediment.
Yes.
So I'd ask, okay, what's the source of this where we have some of these strata span continents, or at least several American states in North America? I said, so what's the source of this? You'd have calculations been done on the size of the mountain that had to be eroded? The other problem is, you could see how, to use a math term, they're discrete layers. They're kind of distinct. So you have one color first and then another color later. Did a mountain of one color? And that's another question. How did it have just one color? Did it start spilling out and then it kind of turned off and another mountain came in and started creating sediments? That there's just a mechanical problem there. And then you combine this with the fish fossils. I said, okay, so on the one hand, as you said, there looks to be like a progression in the fossil record, and I will acknowledge that is problematic. But on the other hand, do these other considerations outweigh that? And at the very least, I'd say, okay, maybe we have to do a timeout and say, maybe at the very least, maybe neither viewpoint is conclusive. So it does bother me if geologists and paleontologists are saying this is settled fact. I'd have to say there's some unsettled anomalies that haven't found resolution in the mainstream model, and for that reason, I personally can't. Aside from the question of Noah's flood, I can't accept the mainstream model is free of serious problems, because there are physical theories that, like geometric optics, they don't have any serious problems like this. This is a serious problem. So going back to where we were, to that part, it was a really long answer, and I thank you for bearing with me. Could you bring up your screen again? That had the thing.
Actually, do you mind if I say a couple things real quick?
Oh, equal time. That was our policy.
No worries.
By all means, just share it.
Yeah. So the first thing that you mentioned in regards to fossils and how they get buried, and they tend to be in kind of complex positions or positions where you're like, well, it looks like it's suffering or something like that. That is actually very true, and I totally agree with that. And that's why most fossils they do tend to be found in biomes where you'll have very kind of wet conditions. You'll have lots of mud, things like that, and those are kind of the reasons why we look in those areas for fossils, is because that's where you're most often going to find fossils, I guess, because that tends to be how fossils are formed. So I totally agree. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the flood couldn't have done the exact same thing, and it does kind of match, at least from a model standpoint, that the flood caused similar conditions to be able to bury animals in the same kind of way, very quick, very cover them over, and they fossilize pretty quickly. I totally agree with that, though. And in regards to the strata, the coloring of the strata, I feel like I've heard that argument before, but I'm not 100% sure. This is just the top of my head, so
Sure.
I don't have anything to back this up, and I'll do my best to find something to support this. But the coloring in the strata is very different, and a lot of that has to do with the weather conditions that existed during a certain period of time. And so you'll have, times where the earth is very cold, times where the earth is very hot, and that has an effect on the coloration and the rock that you'll see. And that's what I've heard, at least. I don't have any evidence to support that. I'll try and find some right now. And then in regards to
actually, that would be a very good and interesting data point. One thing that would be important, and this is, I'm speaking also for my own interest, is whether the size and composition of the grains is different. So if it's not coloring, is the chemical composition different?
Yeah, I would agree that would probably have some sort of impact, as long as that chemical composition couldn't be explained by some, like, I could imagine like an ice age would have an effect on the sedimentary process of certain rocks and may result in slight changes, but to be honest, I don't know the science behind that, so I'm not going to make.
Well, by the way, likewise, I think that would be an interesting question for both of us to explore. I'm not a geochemist. That's not my specialty.
Neither am I. But all that aside, that is an interesting explanation that you offer for the flood, is that coloration and the different kinds of sediments that are coming over.
James, you're fading out on me. Sorry.
I apologize. Yeah, I'm curious whether or not one other way that you could look at that and examine that is by testing whether or not the sediments do change drastically in their chemical composition or not, layer by layer. I don't actually know that they do or not. Maybe they do, and if they do, that is fairly interesting. But if they don't, and that coloration is simply a result of different exposures to climate and to environment, that would be interesting to look at.
Oh, I thoroughly agree.
Yeah. But yeah, go ahead. I'll let you continue.
All right. Yeah, please cut me off if I'm monopolizing the time here. And
no worries.
Now there are some questions about dating these. If we could maybe cut to the chase a little again, because
carbon dating.
I think the anomalies you mentioned are. I'm sorry.
Carbon dating, radiometric dating, I'm assuming.
Yes, and also chemical dating. And I'll tell you some of the research I've been doing on this.
I don't know that much about chemical dating.
Okay, is
that different from carbon dating?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so there are just a little bit of my background. I actually have 2 master's degrees, one in biology and one in applied physics from Johns Hopkins University. So some of my research into this was also why I went to school to study some of the questions. So not that I would necessarily recommend this to anyone wanting to study Noah's flood to suffer through to graduate programs. But you could probably tell that this question was, I think what motivated me a lot was just the personal interest, because I was having a crisis of faith, and it was something very precious to me. And I said, it's just not. I know this is an aside. I said it's just not right to believe something just for the sake of believing it. I mean, I remember I was at a Bible study, and I said, I think I'm about ready to quit the faith. Can you pray for me? I just don't find it believable. And one of the girls in the Bible study, she said, well, why don't you just believe? And, I didn't know what to say because I didn't want to be rude.
That'd make it all easier.
I really wanted to make a snide comment. I said, well, why don't you just believe you have $1 billion in the bank if that makes you feel good? It doesn't make it true. At least I was smart enough not to be diplomatic.
Probably a good call to show some restraint there.
Yeah. I really, so we'll talk about the various radiometric dating because that's very, very important. There are problems for the case of Noah's flood with radiometric dating, but then there are also problems for the mainstream. The problem is that the short-term radiometric dates favors a global flood. So rather than say Noah's flood or the biblical flood, I'm just going to go back to say, how about just some sort of major flood? That's a little bit more modest. Let's say, were the rock layers caused by a major flood?
Okay.
A major flood, and did they form quickly? Or did it happen over? Did the layers? That's actually just a very basic scientific question. What we're looking here. By the way, you see my screen here again?
I do, yeah.
Okay. So the question is, did what we're looking at happen over millions of years, or did it happen over some short time frame? Mm-hmm. That's just a very basic scientific question. So the short-term radiometric dates suggest that this happened, which would be carbon-14. If we look at the fossils, the carbon-14 levels are invariant, somewhat invariant across layers. Mm-hmm. So that would suggest that to the extent we find fossils, I mean, good fossils would be like stuff like seashells. Mm-hmm. The reason that I like seashells is they're not quite as subject to contamination because they're hard. Mm-hmm. So if we get a carbon date that indicates that it's less than 50,000 years old, it takes some calculation to show that it can't be due to contamination. I mean, I've actually worked through some of these. Mm-hmm. And I've actually seen some scientific literature that discounts contamination as the major cause. There'll be some, but mm-hmm. is it the principal cause for the carbon-14? And it's actually a known phenomenon, and it's acknowledged that there are distressingly high trace amounts of carbon-14 across all strata in the fossils. And we try to rule out contamination or other radiometric sources, and I actually had to talk to a nuclear chemist to say, okay, we have to, can we discount like uranium or radium, throwing neutrons into the carbon and converting it, or throwing neutrons into whatever element it is. I actually I had the calculation somewhere where I actually did the reaction rates. It'd be now that I'm talking to you, I'm kind of embarrassed. I need to go back and redo it. So if we see that invariance, I said that's just one thing. Okay, so that's a serious anomaly for the other side. Now, in favor of the old, that this is happened over millions of years, there are other kinds of long-term dates like uranium, with uranium, lead, strontium, all sorts of other ones. Mm-hmm. So right now we have a picture of conflicting, at least for the radiometric side. Not one side can make a killer case. And one reason I went to Johns Hopkins was to look at the issue of long-term radiometric dating. This is like a really deep topic. Just suffice to say it would take 3 hours, which we can talk about it sometime if you're interested. but it is a very difficult topic, and I actually did a term paper. I was taking solid state physics, and professor assigned term papers to all of us, the topic we choose, and I chose the topic of chemical and electrical means of nuclear transmutation, and it does have bearing on the trace amounts of long-term radiometric dates. Short answer is that question is, in my mind, still open. People will say it's closed. I'd say it's open, because chemical and electrical means can change nuclear structure. People didn't want to accept it. I actually had to go to the library at Hopkins and dig up some obscure papers, and I'm finding that there's really a lot of research on this. It's just not front page stuff. But my professor loved the topic. He said that was the topic of the night. So if we could just say, maybe we could just say a timeout and say, let's look at the question more as far as radiometric dating. I don't think it's settled for either side. The chemical dating is interesting. There are there's several kinds of chemical dates, but the one that I've actually been working with the most, and it's actually part of my professional research, is what they call racemization dating. Amino acids in the proteins are in living organisms are all left-handed. Over time, when an organism dies, the left-handed amino acids start to racemize and become right-handed. And they'll flip back and forth, but suffice to say, if it's all left-handed at the start, it starts to become 50% left-handed, 50% right-handed. It's just like if you took a set of coins and they're all heads and you just started randomly flipping them. Over time, they'll become 50% heads, 50% tails, assuming they're fair coins. We see the same thing with the chemical dating. And there's been modest, probably significant lack of racemization. So we can go down to these very old fossils and they're not fully racemized. That is a serious problem chemically. There have been some alternative chemical theories to try to explain why that is. They're not been very successful. So that invariance, where the fossils on the top have about the same racemization state as the fossils on the bottom, suggests to me that the case is still very wide open, that that this layer pictured here, or layers like it, form very quickly. Now, there's some suggestion by one nuclear chemist that I've had some contact with, that we can now start to think about oxidation states. That's another thing. Now that we're finding soft tissue in dinosaurs, there are probably some sort of chemical dates we could apply, because it would be really compelling if we can see that dinosaurs across, like say 100 million year time frames, if they have the same oxidation state, that would indicate to me that the layer formed very quickly. So without even trying to address the larger question, Noah's flood, I said these are interesting scientific questions that are, I think, that are at the very least open.
I agree. I'm Googling it right now, and yeah, I'm verifying everything you're saying. Racemization of fossils has been used to date fossils and whatnot, but there hasn't been a whole lot of study on it. So you're very correct on that. And yeah, I'm interested in learning a little bit more. It would be interesting if all the racemization rates of all the different fossils was mostly equivalent. I think that would be great evidence for a flood.
Can let me stop sharing my screen briefly. If I may say this, just to advocate my obvious bias here, and I'll confess. A lot of times when the mainstream is confronted with anomalous data like that, they'll just kind of dismiss it or ignore it, or say that the matter's settled. I've often been kind of bothered by that. They'll pretend that the matter is settled when I know it's not, because I'll investigate it like like someone trying to be meticulous, and I could say,
Mm-hmm.
you know, some of the claims are really, some of the explanations. This is kind of a mean thing to say. I said, you guys are just acting like the people in church. You know, you're not. You're trying to come forward with kind of a preconceived idea how things are, and when you see something that doesn't agree with it, rather than trying to settle it, you just kind of move on. And there's been almost like a religious dedication to certain ideas. Now, I mean, I'm not trying to be too mean, but that's just what I see, because that would mean that the things that these people have studied for ages, I mean, it's really kind of hard to say that, you know, when someone studied a field that for like 30 years, that maybe their premises are wrong. Even, I mean, that would be true even if there are Christians that accepted, you know, there are Christians that accept evolutionary theory. I think it'd be kind of hard for them to say, well, maybe my science is wrong, because that's, you know, it's hard for anyone to say that.
No, I agree. It probably would be very difficult. Good thing I'm not a scientist, so I don't have to I don't have to worry about that. But
well, one way to go get around that is to do science in fields where you probably won't have to deal with that. I mean, there's certain science, any science field that deals with history can be, we may have a lot of that. And it's really funny because I'll see even evolutionary biologists quarrel among themselves about what evolved from what. But if I could show you may I show you a graph?
Sure, go for it.
Let me see. All right, so this is a graph of racemization states. I have to rework this graph. But what we found, that when we start looking up at all the shells, like the seashells, or fossil shells, I'm sorry, and we count how much carbon, I mean, how much right-handed amino acids there are. What should happen is they should, let me see. Oh, I'm going to have to rework this graph because the way it was done really made it bad. But this,
I think I understand it.
What was supposed to happen is the straight line indicates that it decays over time. The tilted line means that it's invariant over time. That's kind of backward. That's why I don't like this graph, but it's the best one that I could come up with. So what's happening is the predicted, what theory predicts doesn't align with our actual measurements. Our measurements show this tilted line, which means invariance across strata. And this is just, the guy who put this together, it's like I wanted to shoot him. It's like, you could make this a lot clearer. But that's kind of the problem. That's the chemical dating. And I think there's room to do stuff with oxidative dating. There's also stuff with DNA half-lives. That's also very interesting because DNA has a half-life of 521 years. And even adjusted for temperature, we shouldn't be seeing dinosaur DNA, but we are. That's very problematic. Because if the half-life is only 521 years, give or take adjustments by temperature, even if we assume cold temperatures and preservation, we shouldn't be finding any dinosaur DNA. That would be interesting if we do. We do find fossils entombed in amber that have bacterial DNA, and it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be 250 million years old, but it's there. So those are serious chemical problems. So the problem we're working with, as you'll find probably on the wiki sites like the one you cited, I think a lot of the anomalies that they post, they should seriously be considered. I wouldn't try to minimize them. They need to be worked through. So thanks for hearing me. That's the majority of my case for Noah's flood. I just recommend kind of going to maybe smaller questions like is the strata old? Did it form quickly or slowly?
Well,
and
that's the best way to work through things.
Yeah.
Especially, like I'm not a scientist. You have.
Oh, James, you're fading out. Sorry.
I apologize. Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
Cool. I was just going to say that I'm obviously not a scientist, and I'm definitely not an expert on any of the sort of dating methods that scientists use. So definitely the best way to examine it would be to look at each kind of case individually and determine whether or not it's valid. I am very interested in the other dating methods that you propose, especially the chemical dating methods and whatnot. I'll look into that.
Well, if I could say this, this is one reason I'm as a professional in creation science, I'm excited. I think there's an opportunity to learn and experiment and gather more data. So our conversation, I wouldn't say is the final word on these things, but I'm personally excited for what we might find. Obviously, it's not good when a scientist has bias for the conclusion he'd like to see. So I thoroughly admit that. But on the other hand, it's kind of hard to do something if you're not excited about the possibilities.
Totally get that. I totally get that. And yeah, I appreciate the conversation. I did learn a decent amount, and I plan on looking into some of the evidence that you provided a little bit more closely to see whether or not there's validity behind it, because there are some arguments that I hadn't heard before. So
that's great to know. Now, on Reddit, there's the R creation evolution. So that's one way you could stay in touch. And I'll try to be nice when I see you. Okay. I know your handle. I sometimes do lose my temper because there are like 70 people just trying to swarm me, and I had to just block them because they just hate my guts. and sometimes I can be really, really terse.
Don't worry about it.
So, but we can stay in touch, and I look forward to hearing from you again.
Oh yeah, I appreciate it. I'll definitely check that out, and I'll try and get in touch with you on Reddit, or and maybe we can go through some other things a little bit more at some other time. But yeah, I appreciate it.
Yes. So just I want to make sure I have your permission. If this recording is good, can I post it on R Reformed where you posted your original discussion?
Absolutely, yeah. Go for it.
Okay. And I'll post it on YouTube. So I have to express my gratitude for having given me this opportunity to share my viewpoints. So I look forward to us staying in touch, and thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah.
All right. So an early Merry Christmas.
You too. Merry Christmas.
All right. Take care.